Hi everyone, we'll be starting in a few minutes. Just let people get logged in here. Also, if you want to take the time to list your organization in the chat, feel free to, just so we know where everyone's coming from. Also, if you're sending your organization in the chat, make sure you're sending to everyone. There's a few settings in the chat to be mindful of. Okay, so I think we'll get started now. I think some people are still trickling in, so hopefully they don't miss much. But okay, thank you everyone for joining our webinar. Even under quarantine, I know these are kind of weird times. So this is the first of a Palestine Political Education webinar series organized by National SJP, and Palestinian Youth Movement. We put together this series to help keep up momentum of our movements during COVID-19 virtual era, but also to help maintain an updated political education for our community. So my name is Ruby, and I'm a member of both Palestinian Youth Movement and National Students for Justice in Palestine. And I'll be facilitating the conversation today with the help of Roa. Roa, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Roa. I am with National Students for Justice in Palestine. Just to get started, I'm going to give a little bit of background about what the Palestinian Youth Movement is and what National SJP is. So the Palestinian Youth Movement is a grassroots movement of Palestinian and Arab youth who are taking an active role in our struggle for liberation of our homeland and people. PYM brings together youth across political, cultural, and social backgrounds to organize towards a better future characterized by freedom and justice and right of return for all refugees and towards the dismantling of Zionism. They have 10 chapters across North America and are continuing to grow. Their local community organizing involves youth programming, mutual aid community support, cultural workshops and art programs, political education, coalition-based organizing, campaigns to combat Zionism, Islamophobia, racism, militarism, surveillance and policing, refugee services and empowerment, support for political prisoners and their families, BDS campaigns, Indigenous Palestinian joint struggle, conferences, and more. A PYM Student Empowerment Committee is offering organizing trainings, program support for retreats and events, and political education resources for students, and is excited to collaborate with NSJP on this series. So now a little bit about NSJP. National Students for Justice in Palestine is a collective body of organizers within the Palestinian Solidarity Movement that supports over 250 student groups by hosting annual conferences, developing a shared agenda, providing a platform for collaboration, and setting a political vision for our network, as well as connecting with the broader global movement for freedom, equality, and justice in Palestine. National SJP serves as a resource and guide to local chapters. We are so grateful to have PYM and our guest speakers today in our webinar series kickoff. We hope for the series to help connect and educate our communities, and we value your preferences. A little bit later on, we're going to talk about a survey that we're going to send out. So please do fill that out so that we can take that feedback and help create the content for the upcoming webinars. So now Ruby is going to tell us a little bit about what we're going to cover today.
Yes, so today's webinar topic is Free Them All from Palestine to US. This was inspired by Palestinian Political Prisoners Day, which is this Friday, April 17th. So in today's conversation, we are going to discuss the history of Palestinian political prisoners, prison abolition work in the US, current conditions and demands of political prisoners amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. So to briefly outline this webinar, we will have our three guests each speak for about 20 to 30 minutes. We'll reserve time at the end of the webinar for questions. So please feel free to write your questions in the Q&A panel. So make sure not to add that to the chat, but specifically to the Q&A section. That's where we'll review the questions at the end. And we plan for the webinar to go on for about an hour and a half to 2 hours total. Yeah, so let's get started. Our panelists include Osama, who was previously a steering member of National SJP and is now an organizer with the Palestinian Youth Movement and is currently serving as the general coordinator of the Atlanta chapter. And representing California Coalition of Women's Prisoners, we have Diana Block, who has been an anti-imperialist feminist activist since the 1970s. She's a founding and active member of the California Coalition for Women's Prisoners and is on the coordinating committee for the statewide CURB Anti-Prison Coalition. Diana is also the author of memoir titled Arm the Spirit, and she writes for various online journals. And joining us from Dream Defenders, we have Zaina. Zaina Sus organizes towards a world without prisons, Right now, she is helping lead jail decarceration campaign work in Miami, Florida. So we'll begin with Osama, who will discuss the Palestinian Political Prisoners movement. So I'll pass it on to you, Osama.
Hey, it's Osama. Can you guys hear me? Great. So first of all, thank you all for introducing this webinar and facilitating. I'm really excited and looking forward to this discussion, which is arranged at such a, I think, pivotal time in our movements. The questions of prison abolition, the role of the prisoner, in that respect, internationalism as a principle and strategy amidst this pandemic, the question of our people who are at risk, these questions are all very relevant during this time. First, I want to begin with a key point here that in the Palestinian context especially, the political prisoner struggle constitutes one of the most important elements of Palestinian liberation. Palestinian political prisoners are on the front lines of the struggle for self-determination, and you know, key to that is knowing that they are in daily confrontation with their occupiers. With that said, they represent a heroic community in the popular consciousness of the Palestinian people. As Salmidun declares, an organization dedicated to advancing the struggle of Palestinian political prisoners, they say Palestinian prisoners are at the center of the struggle for freedom and justice in Palestine. They represent the imprisonment of a people and a nation. And so, you know, in my session, I hope the objectives to be covered will be the inception and development of the prisoner struggle, highlighting the Palestinian prisoners movement, internationalism, the connections drawn between political prisoners in Palestine, with Northern Ireland, with many other struggles around the world, and talking a little bit about current work and COVID-19, amidst COVID-19. We also have to assess what we believe are the usual liberal frameworks of understanding the prisoner. What are they and where do they come from in terms of these frameworks? I mean, who decides whom is imprisoned and why? Who implements these decisions? When we see mass imprisonment of a particular people, for what political reason then? And what is the history of that? Next slide, please. Just to cover some early chronology of the prison, in the British Mandate period, 1920 to 1948, the British Mandate came about through the Balfour Declaration of 1917, in which the British imperial power promised to the Zionist colonial movement an independent Jewish state in historic Palestine. Essentially, the British Mandate facilitated the Zionist movement's colonization of Palestine. And in order to consolidate during this period, their colonial authority in Palestine, they established prisons in almost every town and city. The British Mandate did. These prisons were routinely established in such a way as the location would overlook a city, serving as panopticons. And if anyone's heard of a panopticon, essentially, it's designed in such a way as to allow all prisoners, within a prison, it's designed in such a way as to allow all prisoners to be watched by the prison guard by placing the guard in the center. The prisoners would not know they're being watched. Although it is impossible for, you know, a single prison guard to be watching all prisoners, you know, at the same time, it psychologically conditions prisoners to act as if they are being watched at all times. These prisons were augmented by these very same prisons, many of whom were augmented by the Israeli occupation and continued to use them. And today they're still being used to detain Palestinians from the lands occupied in 1967. Briefly, the Great Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939, which was a mass popular revolt initiated by Palestinians, when it became most clear that there was a British imperialist conspiracy against them, i.e. the facilitation of the Zionist colonial movement, you had this massive uprising initiated by Palestinians, culminating in strikes, culminating in a lot of direct action. This was also the first time you had such an extensive experience of mass imprisonment in Palestine and also of martyrdom. So we see this from this period, this concept or this motif of the prisoner or the martyr, slowly developed into being a part of the Palestinian fabric. So the Palestinian political prisoners in the Israeli prison system in the early 70s and even today look to their ancestors and their experiences of imprisonment in the early 30s as their model and tradition of political captivity as a way to build revolutionary consciousness and knowledge. In the Zionist period, after the Nakba of 1948, you had internment camps. And these internment camps are not well known in the history, mainly because the files, so the International Committee of the Red Cross at the time were aware of these camps and what occurred in these camps, but these files only became accessible in 1996 when the ICRC adopted new access rules in response to exceptional public interest in the org's organization and the org's century role in conflicts around the world. So beginning in 1948, you had approximately 9,000 Palestinians placed in these camps. These camps were set up by Zionist militias in ethnically cleansed Palestinian villages and military camps left over from the British Mandate. The prisoners in these camps were used as a source of forced labor for the military, working, for instance, in factories that actually manufactured products for the Israeli army. During this time, you also had dispersal and lack of communities. So any attempt at organizing during this time was exceedingly difficult due to the fragmentation of the new inception of, a fragmented Palestine, a fragmented community, lack of networks, lack of organization and leadership. So administrative detention was introduced actually via British law to subdue Palestinians, and it's enshrined in Zionist legality to this day, such as the emergency powers detentions law, the order regarding administrative detention. Administrative detention is essentially holding without trial, imprisoning without trial for usually the given reason of security, that this person poses a security risk to the state. And so since 1967, you've had over 50,000 administrative detention orders given. And at this time, there's approximately 431 Palestinians as of January 2020 that are imprisoned on an administrative detention order. Next slide, please. So following the Six-Day War, and this basically is the lead up to talking about the contemporary struggles and conditions of the Palestinian political prisoners. But following the Six-Day War and occupation of the remaining Palestinian lands, Palestinian prisoners in Israeli custody were forced to again work without wages as part of a system of forced labor. Overall, since 1967, in the West Bank and Gaza alone, you've had over 800,000 Palestinians incarcerated by the Zionist entity. The Israeli legal system refused to acknowledge or recognize Palestinian resistance, those engaged in Palestinian resistance as prisoners of war, and considered them outside the laws of war. describing them as terrorists. Essentially, the aims of Israeli imprisonment during this time was to isolate and to pacify. So to isolate Palestinian revolutionaries and dissidents from their families, from their society, in order to pacify their nationalist aspirations. And from this, you had a prisoner's response. Next slide. So the imperial capitalist colonial prison, their intention and what they're meant to do is to disconnect its inmates by isolation. At least that's the aim of the builders and owners and the prison guards. By contrast, the inmates of the prison seek to communicate, seek to reconnect themselves to each other and to their society. So what we see during this time in the in the late 60s, organizing within the prisons began. So the Palestinian Prisoners Movement, although it was not a fully fledged movement at this time, this is when we essentially see the roots. What the Palestinian prisoners did at this time was to utilize, and what they aimed to do was to utilize new tactics of communication, right? So they're being isolated from each other. They're not encouraged to be together in groups. And so they would rely on secretive means of communication, such as writing messages on cigarette papers and passing them along to each other. Or in the case of the capsula or capsule, which is essentially a capsule in which a message would be written on a piece of paper and rolled up and put in a capsule, which would either be passed by hand or in some cases swallowed. And when it's swallowed, it would be discharged. They would discharge it in their stool in order to, these are the levels at which they went to communicate and to build community. During this period, we saw the emergence of some early hunger strikes. These hunger strikes, and I'm gonna touch upon this and elaborate on the meaning and significance of the hunger strike, but they were organized in order to yield improvements to the prison conditions, whether it could be something as simple as allowing family pictures, allowing literature, books, newspapers, pens, fighting for the right to complete their high school examinations and university examinations within the prison. So during this period, you've also had this, the prisoners develop internal programs of education, programs of training in terms of confrontation with the interrogator, how to deal with the interrogator, how to deal with the fact that now they're cut off. What you also saw characterize the Palestinian prisoners movement during this time was this sort of decentralized democratic decision-making that allowed them to organize and allowed them to build community and allow them to make decisions, political decisions, whether it was hunger strikes, which goals to fight for and why. Next slide, please. I want to talk briefly about in the 80s, and we were jumping to the 80s mainly for sake of time. There's a very rich history within the Palestinian prisoner experience. But the political backdrop of the 1980s, what you had was the exile of the PLO. You had the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon, which led to the exile of the PLO. And from then, the PLO had intended to shift their political direction towards the occupied Palestinian territories. So what this means is that PLO then began to support various committees in the occupied territories, the Palestinian National Front, trade unions, and a fund to support prisoners and a fund to support steadfastness. So during this time, you had a proliferation of popular committees, unions, among students, workers, women, and local communities. The Palestinian Prisoners Movement reflected these broad changes. The Palestinian Prisoners Movement, while being in prison, were not disconnected, were not isolated from changes and political waves that were occurring on the Palestinian streets. So as you had local, within the occupied Palestinian territories, as you had the PLO shift its direction to it, and as you had slowly this decision made to not abandon, but shift away from armed struggle within the occupied Palestinian territories, you had an influx of younger people coming into the prisons who were organizers, who were activists, that were imprisoned sometimes on mere affiliation. So mere affiliation with a Palestinian political party would get you imprisoned. So with these broad changes, with this shift from armed struggle towards mass-based structures or mass committees established, popular committees established, which was eventually the lead up to the First Intifada, you also had a diversification of the demographics within the prison, namely that of younger Palestinian students. So with veterans that were engaged in armed struggle, you also had younger Palestinian students. And together, this diversification led to increased decentralization of the national movement within the prisons. So while there was decentralization outside of the prison, it was experienced within the prison in terms of organization, in terms of political decision-making. So in a sense, during this time, universities and prisons became incubators for the Palestinian movement, producing new leaders, producing revolutionaries, defying the occupation. Next slide, please. And also, all questions, there will be a question and answer session at the end. So in the lead up to the First Intifada, and I know we're skipping, but again, it's for the sake of time. In the lead up to the First Intifada, you had the full-on development within the prisons, within the internal programs of education, which you can call schools of revolution. So the Palestinian Political Prisoners Movement, as a community as well, organized programs of education covering history, foreign languages, such as Hebrew, political theory, and more. Inside the prisons, there was even production of magazines written in notebooks, disseminated in the prisons, featuring poetry, literary criticisms, political analysis. In some, the site of the Israeli prison became major centers for artistic production, intellectual debates, education, and political organization. The schools of revolution enabled such a powerful prisoners collective to be forged, which continuously, thanks to this level of organization and programming, gave rise to highly esteemed leaders and leaderships from within the ranks of the prisoners. So it's important to note here also the relationship of the prison to the Palestinian streets. To note, as we are getting to the prelude of the Intifada, the Palestinian Prisoners Movement eventually practiced at its peak, eventually was able to practice a solid cross-factional cooperative leadership years before the emergence of the popular committees that we saw emerge during the Intifada. So while the organizational structure, because their organization and democratic decision-making emerged years before that same kind of organization we see develop on the Palestinian streets, the organizational structure of the Palestinian Prisoners movement served as a model for the development of the formations outside the prison that facilitated the uprising. So the growth, at the same time, the growth and advances made by the popular committees on the streets also fed into the Palestinian Prisoners movement and their organization and their organizational capacity. So what you had here was this relationship, bilateral relationship, an empowering relationship through which the Palestinian streets and the prisoners were able to coordinate between each other, were able to develop each other's organizational capacities. This relationship was pivotal to the formation of key structures that sustained the popular struggle against the Israeli occupation during the First Intifada. Next slide. I want to speak a little bit about Sumud, as it's very relevant when we talk about the overall strategy and what the guiding philosophy was of the Palestinian political prisoners. Sumud meaning steadfastness in Arabic. The meaning of Sumud in the Palestinian context carries within it a meaning of, staying on one's land despite the threats made by the colonial occupation. So akin to the olive tree, which stretches its roots deep into the land, Palestinians wanted to embody that, and they did embody that. So Sumud was a national liberation concept, essentially, which focused on the development of self-sufficiency. Self-sufficiency was seen as a way to detach oneself from the confines of the occupation. So during the First Intifada, which is, as we were speaking about previously, the popular committees that were established were based on this principle, that socioeconomic problems were considered political realities. So they didn't just exist as, in a vacuum. They existed based on political realities by which the Israeli occupation was the root cause. So problems such as poverty, problems regarding healthcare, agriculture, women's struggle, labor rights and labor organizing. And during this time through Sumud, you also had alternate methods of economic survival which were being developed as boycotts were organized and more. And all of these are examples of Sumud. And Sumud carries on to this day, but it truly saw its full expression as a political strategy and a national liberation concept during the First Intifada. Next slide. So within the prison, the philosophy of prison struggle can come down to, can be characterized as an extension of Sumud, or is Sumud. So the interrogation. The interrogation served as the inceptual confrontation. So when a prisoner enters the prison, there's this, the first real experience, the first real confrontation you had with the prison guard was through the interrogation. So where the colonizer within that setting has the power to control every detail of the setting, the techniques being deployed to extract complicity from the colonized. So in the confrontation of the interrogation, the interrogator attempts to disconnect the captive from his sense of belonging to a collective. And so the manual, there was an institutionalization of Sumud through manuals such as the philosophy of confrontation behind the prison bars. And what this manual did was basically was to teach the captives to remember the party, remember the neighborhood, remember their friends, remember their family while they're being interrogated. So to understand Sumud in the context of this confrontation, we have to remember also that the sole weapon the prisoner has is the body, right? Sumud as a revolutionary tool then was used to disrupt the colonial relations between, to disrupt the colonial relations by refusing to acknowledge and cooperate with the colonial system. And this was just one of many manuals and many examples of how Sumud and the philosophy of how to engage and discipline yourself within the prison was. Next slide. To speak briefly about Oslo, there's little time to go over why Oslo was a setback for the Palestinian struggle, but I'm just going to reiterate Edward Said when he said Oslo was and is an instrument of Palestinian surrender. Oslo gravely impacted the Palestinian prisoner movement and their ability to organize. So Oslo being presented as a solution in terms of land for peace. However, the way they saw it was that land and freedom on their land were the principles for which they were imprisoned. So the subsequent Palestinian Authority did not give the freedom of the freedom for the prisoners and the rights that they deserved. It was not until 2001 and later in 2003 that a number of pre-Oslo prisoners were released, but there are still pre-Oslo prisoners that are still behind bars. To talk briefly about security collaboration, the Palestinian Authority, the quasi, governmental neo-colonial government that was formulated through the Oslo Accords, was engaged in security collaboration, is engaged with security collaboration with the Israeli occupation. And one of the manifestations of this is the revolving door policy. The revolving door policy essentially describes how Palestinians who may be imprisoned by the Palestinian Authority themselves for rebelling against the PA, for opposing the PA hegemony, for opposing PA collaboration with Israel, would be released temporarily, only to land in Zionist jails shortly after. And a number of figures in Palestinian political history, Bassel al-A'raj and Khalid al-Jarrar, are examples of this policy. Next slide. During this period, we saw in Oslo institute this formulation of state development, meaning there was a shift away from the mass-based revolutionary structures and organizations that proliferated during the First Intifada. So you had a shift then from the national liberation framework towards legal human rights frameworks. And what we had was the collaboration between the organizations inside and outside the prison were basically diminished, which leads to the struggle of the prisoner being most dire today. I'll end with that short history and chronology of the Palestinian Political Prisoners movement. But this was to give a sense, actually, if you can go to the key attributes. So the key attributes, I missed that. So the key attributes of the Palestinian prisoner movement, the key points that I want to leave with today, is that the Palestinian prisoner struggle is not simply a branch of injustice. We can't just think about it and describe it as just another statistic, essentially. It's that the Palestinian prisoners serve the Palestinian national movement as leaders. They can run and have won positions in government. Prisoner actions, as in the history, often supersede factionalization, which characterizes the Palestinian movement today. Essentially, that Palestinian prisoners are the compass of our struggle. Many times their actions will foment and ignite organizing outside the prisons, on the streets, in solidarity and in defense of the prisoners, fighting for their gains and fighting for their rights. And I will end there.
Thank you so much, Osama. That was really informative. So now we'll move on to Diana from California Coalition for Women Prisoners to tell us about the work that she does, the work her organization does, and talk about abolition and decarceration and the current conditions on the ground. So passing it on to you, Diana. Diana, I think you're muted. There you go.
Okay, now, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear
you. Yes, good. First, I just want to say thank you for inviting me and the California Coalition for Women Prisoners, CCWP, to be part of this very important webinar. And I really appreciated the whole history and framing that Osama just laid out, because it really helps to understand so much of the parallel developments between the carceral systems in Israel and the United States, which in fact I think have developed in very similar ways to repress the resistance and to enforce colonial conditions since the 1960s and 70s and through the present. So before I talk about CCWP, I'm just going to say very quickly that that there have been, as most of the people here I'm sure know, decades of mass incarceration, mass imprisonment have developed, which have been accompanied by extreme sentencing and overcrowding in prisons and jails. This is particularly true in California, where CCWP is based. To us, mass incarceration is a tool of a racist, capitalist, colonialist system, which has been built upon the colonization and repression of different communities of color, and which at this stage really has to warehouse Black and other people of color to maintain its social and economic control. And it uses a racist, fear, crime-driven narrative to build public support for this level of imprisonment. And so while the language and the narrative isn't exactly the same in Palestine or regarding Palestinians and in this country, the US, but there are many parallels and ways in which the demonization of people who are imprisoned is necessary to justify what is going on and that level of imprisonment. So to go back to, or to start with CCWP, this organization was founded in 1995 by people inside and outside of the women's prisons in California. And it was founded explicitly to deal with very abusive healthcare conditions inside. And that is one of the, markers of imprisonment, which is only exaggerated in the current era in terms of the ways in which prisoners do not have access to anything approaching even the community standards of healthcare. And that's very true, as I understand, in Palestine now in terms of the pandemic, and also certainly in California and across the United States in prisons and jails. So we were formed around healthcare issues, but we quickly developed into be working with people inside to address a whole array of abusive conditions, and have really concentrated on both monitoring and responding to the conditions inside prisons, California's women's prisons, but also to the only real way to deal with those conditions is to release people. So from an abolitionist perspective, we really have always struggled to figure out the broadest messaging possible around release, and not only messaging, but actual developing strategies to be able to implement real release. And so we have won releases for survivors of domestic violence, women and transgender people with life sentences, and many other people who are inside. We conduct monthly legal visits in the women's prisons in order to gather information, to be able to be part of, understand what's happening. And it's also really a means of supporting people with their own organizing strategies inside, even though that is not what we call it, because as, well, even more so inside US prisons, if you're accused of organizing, that's the basis for being sent to solitary confinement. For the past several years, we've also focused on challenging a particular form of extreme sentencing, the life without parole sentence, which is basically death by incarceration. It's a form of extreme sentence that really, the United States is one of the only countries in the world that has that kind of a sentence. It's but since the United States is also trying to export its model of carcerality to the world, it's something that we can expect other countries to unfortunately adopt. So our campaign against LWOP, that's what life without parole sentencing is called, is the abbreviation, has succeeded in winning clemency for over 150 people, which may not seem like a lot, but since there was no clemency at all before our campaign began, we feel like it has some momentum, and it is being joined by efforts around the country to demand clemency for a variety of people who are imprisoned. For us, abolition is about dismantling a racist system whose goals are punishment, social control, profit, and warehousing of people, the majority of whom are people of color and poor. The prison industrial complex is a complex. It begins, or it doesn't begin, but the term begins with imprisonment, but it includes an array of different forms of control, which are surveillance, electronic monitoring, probation and parole systems, policing, and increasingly the re-entry system is also an aspect of the prison industrial complex, because it's constantly finding ways to expand its reach and its control over people's lives and physical bodies. At the same time as we struggle for a vision of abolition, no prisons, or fundamentally dismantling the current system, we're very committed to working with people inside to win individual release and support their efforts to survive inside. And there's always a balance between those things that is complicated to figure out, but it's, you know, when you work with people inside, they want to get out, but they also have to demand better health care. They have to demand an end to sexual abuse from guards, which happens all the time within women's prisons in California and across the country. And so we try and figure out ways to work with people and do the systemic kinds of organizing at the same time as we're also doing individual advocacy. For us, abolition is also about international solidarity, since the US projects its model of carceral control across the globe. And that is, you know, you can see that in many places. Israel is one of the leading examples. In fact, I feel like Israel and the US have developed this model together. But then you have lots of other places, Brazil, the Philippines, Mexico, all of those, and the list would go on in terms of countries which have really imported, or the US has exported the model to them. And so we have developed a project within the larger CCWP organization, which is more focused on international solidarity, which we call Firestorm. And within that project, we have worked to try and develop forms of solidarity with Palestinian prisoners, with an emphasis on women prisoners. I and another member of CCWP were lucky enough to be part of a delegation that was led by Dr. Professor Rabab Abdul Hadi several years ago, in which there was a focus on meeting and with former prisoners in Palestine. And we really learned a tremendous amount through that actual visit, in-person delegation. And then we tried to bring it back to this country through slideshows and presentations at different community and academic events, and have really been trying to build ways or develop ways of being in solidarity in an ongoing basis. And we have recently been working with different members in the Bay Area of PYM on an art show project with Adamir. But that has been postponed for many different reasons right now in this current period. So I think we are just very committed to both development of solidarity and using a wide array of tactics within this country to really tear down the whole prison system, free them all. The slide that you are looking at is a part of a recent Twitter storm that we were part of, partnering with people in New York City to demand clemency from both Governor Newsom and Governor Cuomo. And we have continued many different tactics like that in this current period. I think that we will be talking about the specifics around the current period a little later. So I will stop with that, and hope that there will be some time for questions and answers okay, that's good, thank you. The demands that we have been, the demands are good because the demands reflect our current campaigns around decarceration in the current period. So it's both decarceration and it's also demanding very concrete things inside the prisons that will allow people to survive. And these demands all come from our continual contact and communication with people inside the prisons. And I guess if there's one thing I would like to end this section of my presentation on is the absolute importance of being in touch and in solidarity with people inside as part of an abolitionist struggle, because you learn so much from the people who are in prison about what they need, what they want, how to develop strategies to actually confront the system. And so we in CCWP have always tried to prioritize the voices of people inside. And we have a newsletter that we've done for almost 25 years called The Fire Inside. And we use that to both provide a place for people to express themselves and their thoughts and their ideas inside the newsletter, and also to educate people outside about what's going on. So thanks again for the opportunity to discuss with you. There's, of course, so much more that could be said about every aspect of what we're doing, but I'll come back to the action items, I think, at a later point, unless the agenda has changed. Let me know, Ruby, whether I should do it differently. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll give you time for the action items later. Thank you so much, Diana. That was a really informative presentation. Thank you for all your work. So now we'll move on to Diana We'll move on to Zaina from Dream Defenders to tell us a little bit about what Dream Defenders does and to explain some of the prison abolition work that she does.
Hey y'all, how's it going? Just want to say thank you so much to the organizers of this call. Thank you so much to everyone who's on this call, 8 p.m. on a Wednesday night, especially with everything that's happening. You know, your presence is a gift. Thank you so much to Alsema and Diana. It was perfect to hear from you both. Feel really honored to be in struggle with you all. And it was really helpful, I think, because, you know, with Osama's context and Diana talking about, you know, her organization's practice in California, I think that really helps lay some really important groundwork for what I'm going to kind of try to go over. I mean, we could spend an hour on just any one piece of all of this. And so I'm going to do my best to kind of give a little bit about in terms of like how Dream Defenders thinks in terms of abolition and how it connects also to our principles of international solidarity. So giving a little bit of the theory and then also a little bit of our practice and how we're trying to move decarceration work right now, especially in a time of crisis. So yeah, with that, I'm gonna just jump right in. So this is kind of borrowing from, you know, Angela Davis' famous text, "Are prisons obsolete?" So our empire's obsolete, right? And so connecting our principles around prisons and prison abolition also to our principles around the self-determination of oppressed people to be liberated all over the world. So I wanted to begin with our kind of thinking around worldview. Really, when we're talking about abolition, you know, when we're talking about, you know, the different principles of our practice, what we're also talking about is how do we reimagine the we, and really how do we imagine freedom? Who helps us imagine freedom? So actually, you know, if folks feel comfortable, I would even love it if folks could even throw in the chat, you know, who helps you practice and imagine freedom. I think that's an incredibly important aspect of being an abolitionist, is imagining freedom and being in the constant sort of place of imagining freedom. And that's something that we really do try to take seriously with Dream Defenders in terms of our cultural organizing and culture shifting work. So to begin from a we, a prerequisite to seeking any social change is the naming of it. In other words, even though the goal we seek may be far away, unless we name it and fight for it today, it will never come. And that's from Rose Brass with Critical Resistance, an organization that we really admire and have learned a lot from in terms of our practice around prison and police abolition work. Solidarity did not mean subsuming your struggles to help someone else. It was intended to strengthen the political commitments from other groups by getting them to recognize how the different struggles were related to each other under capitalism. So again, that's incredibly important. When we say solidarity, we take that word very seriously. And so something to say about Dream Defenders, we are an organization that believes in ideology. So what does that mean? Everyone who wants to join Dream Defenders, recognizing that we self-identify as an organization that is abolitionist, that is socialist, that is feminist, and internationalist. And the reason why we believe in ideology is that we believe that revolution is not assumed. There's no guarantee for us to win liberation. We have to fight for it. We have to practice it. We have to imagine it, and we must become scientists in the practice of liberation. And so for us, ideology becomes the tools that we use in our practice of dreaming and practicing liberation, and solidarity being one of the most powerful tools. And if I know anything at all, it's that a wall is just a wall and nothing more at all. It can be broken down. And that's from Sister Asada, from her poem, Affirmation. So I could say so much about who the Dream Defenders are, the fact that we're over 8 years old, the fact that we are an organization that was born in response to the tragic murder of a child, a Black child, by a white vigilante. Since that time, Dream Defenders has been, marching and fighting and studying in living rooms and on the street and in classrooms and across all different kinds of terrains and conditions to really get to this place where we are intentionally articulating a vision of Florida free from prisons. And one of the most important ways that we articulate that vision is through a manifesto and a visionary document that we call the Freedom Papers. And so I think I'm going to let this video kind of speak for itself in terms of who we are and what we do and what we believe in.
They say corporations magically make the world go round. They say businessmen keep the lights on, that they have the power to hire the sun and send it home at night. They say bankers are great angels from on high that descend from heavenly penthouses with messages from the bank of God. They say hell on earth can all be eased with their credit and cars and clothes. They'll tell you the real problem ain't them. The real problem is your man or your woman, that nigga or that illegal or that white boy. And if we could just do away with them, we could all do big business better together. But we know better. We know about their eviction letters and rent hikes, cut hours and unpaid overtime. We know who makes this country great. So we praise the cooks and the cashiers. We praise the bus boys and bus drivers. We praise the waiters and dishwashers. We praise the maids. We praise the trash men, the last men to stand with King before he became a holiday. We're tired of begging for crumbs from the meals that we cook. So we offer these 7 freedoms like ultralight beams in the dead of night, like pictures of possibility, a new North Star. These are the Freedom Papers.
Police were never meant to protect and serve me and you. They started as slave catchers, and businessmen started the first organized police department to protect their property and products. Prisons exploded as work camps for newly freed slaves. Police and prisons, since their founding, have always been about safety for the haves and brutality for us. Today, private corporations like Florida's Geo Group make billions of dollars off probation fees, deportation and detention centers, phone calls, commissary, halfway houses, and ankle bracelets. That ain't justice. That's enforcing the line between rich and poor. We can't keep running to find safety where it was never meant to be. By virtue of being born, each of us has the absolute right to people-centered humane justice and violence prevention. An end to this prison and policing system. The end to bail and probation and reinvestment of all that money into social services in our community. This is freedom from prisons.
So that was a little bit of a taste of the Freedom Papers. I encourage y'all to watch all the Freedom Papers videos and do read the document on your own. It's available online. Read it, share it, spread it, study it with us. So Diana already spoke a little bit to this. I'm sure many folks have maybe heard this term before, the prison industrial complex. One of the reasons why it's so important for us to really, again, emphasize the PIC rather than just talking about, for example, I think a lot of people might hear like private prisons, the private prison industry, and things like that. Unfortunately, when we talk about private prisons, it kind of does this thing where it erases the fact that state-owned prisons, right, are still a part of an entire matrix and an entire economy that is dependent on the extraction, violent domination, and displacement of indigenous people, violence against Black folks and immigrants, right? And so this is, when we say it's a complex, we do mean that it is very much deeply, deeply tethered, right, to the entire U.S. economy, and certainly the military-industrial complex, and all these other aspects of how the U.S. maintains its domination. And so this is a definition from Critical Resistance. They have a ton of resources on their website. I really highly encourage folks to study Critical Resistance if you are interested in abolition or new to abolition. So yeah, the prison industrial complex is a term we use to describe the overlapping interests of government and industry. They use surveillance, policing, and imprisonment as solutions to economic, social, and political problems. The time of COVID-19 could not illuminate these forces more sharply, right? We have people, we'll have 10 cops pulling someone off a bus in Philly for not wearing a mask. We'll have cops, many of whom are getting infected, not wearing masks, arresting houseless folks, taking them to jails where they're at much higher risk of infection. Again, just to punish and socially control and warehouse poor folks, rather than admit that the state actually owes us housing, owes us basic necessities, owes us, a life of dignity as working people that are part of this society. So I did say before that Dream Defenders are explicitly socialists. We believe that capitalism is the most violent economic system to ever exist. We believe that capitalism is the crisis. If COVID-19 is the virus, we believe that capitalism is the crisis. And so it's also really important for us to understand how policing and prisons are deeply rooted in the expansion and maintenance of capitalism. And so Robin D.G. Kelly is a comrade. He's definitely helped a lot with political education with Dream Defenders and our history. And so this is a quote from an article of his. Capitalism and racism, in other words, did not break from the old order, but rather evolved from it to produce a modern world system of racial capitalism dependent on slavery, violence, imperialism, and genocide. Really fast, I think a lot of folks on this call are probably super familiar. I'm sorry if this is already understood knowledge for a lot of people. I'm just not sure about who's on the call, but just really important I should mention, racial capitalism does not mean that there's good capitalism and bad capitalism. All capitalism, right, is contingent on creating these categories of racial inferiority and racial superiority. And so I think a lot of what I'm going to say is going to sound super familiar because it's probably echoing what you heard from Osama in terms of the ways in which Israel and the colonial occupier, right, uses criminalization to really reinforce these categories, these racialized categories of difference to keep people even more violently oppressed, and then to also blame them for their oppression. And so also it's really important, even if not all prisons are private prisons, we know that the reason why prisons exist is to protect the profits of rich folks. And so one text that I am always recommending to people is Jackie Wang's Carceral Capitalism. And so just, really fast, in the United States, we are left with increased financialization, low-wage service sector work, and surplus populations. So again, that term surplus populations should sound familiar to a lot of folks who study, who have family in Palestine, who know what's happening in Gaza, right? It's this creation of this idea that these workers we don't need, and so we're gonna force them into a slow death. We're going to force them to work for crumbs. We're going to shut them out of the economy. We're going to shut them out of of voting and civil liberties, right? And create this sort of like classes of human. And so the same thing with the US in terms of how they use criminalization. Wang argues that local, state, and federal institutions manage these surplus populations through 5 main tactics: the financial state of exception, automation, extraction and looting, confinement, and finally, gratuitous violence. And then I also have a quote in reference to Ruth Wilson Gilmore's Golden Gulag, which is another like really foundational text for anyone who wants to, again, learn more about prison abolition. Ruth Wilson Gilmore is an incredible thinker and a really, really important scholar to that work. California's solution to dealing with Black unrest, surplus populations and capital, falling agricultural productivity, and real estate problems was to push capital investment into prisons through state bonds and other measures. So this is happening, right? While they also demonize poor folks, Black folks, immigrants, to make them seem like there's this like specter of danger, and the only way for us to be safe, right, is through hyper-policing and prisons. So again, this is going to keep sounding familiar because this is also exactly how Israelis talk about Palestinians, as this sort of demographic threat that needs to be made to be obedient and to fall in line. So then how do we get from this, from talking about, you know, prisons in the US to being in solidarity with Palestine, right? Which, again, if you're looking at the evening news or on Twitter, right, you might not think that those things are deeply connected, but we think that they are. So historic patterns, you know, why take up the question of Palestine as a Black and brown abolitionist in the US South? So here's what we're against, right? We see imperialism as an advanced form of racial capitalism. You know, we also see what's happening in Palestine as another apartheid, right? Which is legalized racial discrimination. And we also see what's happening in Palestine as a form of settler colonialism and reactionary nationalism. So I wanted to say that because that term actually comes from the Panthers, particularly Huey Newton. And so we want to make a distinction between nationalism in Cuba and Venezuela with nationalism in Israel and the US, right? Because Israel and the US are reactionary nationalist settler colonies, so their nationalism is always going to be tied to advanced capitalism and to white supremacy, whereas other nationalist liberation movements are tied to a very different worldview. And so we might be in solidarity with a nationalist movement if it is also, you know, again, for the people, like the ones in Cuba and Venezuela. So, and then what are we for, right? What do we believe in? So we believe in the right to self-determination. We believe in the right to dignity and land. And another thing that, you know, we learned from Palestinians, you know, both in the inside of prisons and on the outside, is this refusal to disappear. And it's certainly true that prisoners practice some of the most advanced and inspiring tactics of resilience and militancy across all sectors of our movements. And that's really, really important for us to really look to them for leadership in terms of how we can resist and how we can survive. And so this is just a photo from one of the first delegations that Dream Defenders took a lot of like Black luminaries to Palestine. And so a lot of these folks also, you know, were really integral in building out the Black Lives Matter struggle, which was an insurgent movement, which to this day has completely shifted the political landscape in terms of how we talk about criminalization and how we talk about police and prisons. And so it's so incredibly important for us to be building these connections with each other across borders and how our struggles are deeply connected. And so like, this is what we mean by imperialism, right? And again, this is probably like basic knowledge for a lot of people, but maybe it's not. And so I just want to kind of like take a second on that. If it were necessary to give the briefest possible definition of imperialism, we should have to say that imperialism is the monopoly stage of capitalism. And this is from Lenin. And so here's that, right? And then here's where we're at, right? Where these like, you know, 8 people have as much wealth as the bottom half of the entire world, right? So that's what we mean by monopoly capitalism, is that all the wealth in the world is brutally extracted into fewer and fewer hands. And so policing and imperialism, right, they follow the same model, which is to say, we're going to extract from you until you have nothing left, until you are forced into brutality and death, blame you for it while getting rich off of your misery, right? Off of your extracted labor, off of this system of domination. Instead of just taxing these rich people so that we could all live a life of dignity and abundance, right? And so this is also important in terms of just, again, like conceptualizing just how much harm and just how much extraction this parasitic form of governance, has perpetuated. So America has spent $5.9 trillion on wars in the Middle East and Asia since 2001. Right, and so especially right now, when unemployment is projected to hit 30%, when we're defunding the World Health Organization, to see just the level of money wasted on militarism and brutality across the world is really stark. So this is a quote from George Jackson, who is a member of the Panthers. He wrote an incredible book. She's right next to me. The Prison Letters of George Jackson. You should read this. Soledad, brother. Whoop, whoop. So George Jackson is very beloved by Palestinians. Famously, George Jackson had hand copied a poem from Samah al-Qassam, Enemy of the Sun. There's actually, an art exhibit. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with it, but if you're not, it's a really beautiful story. George Jackson was a revolutionary, and he was a prisoner, and a theorist. And so I think this quote of his is really powerful. Settle your quarrels, come together, understand the reality of our situation, understand that fascism is already here, that people are already dying who could be saved, that generations more will live poor, butchered half lives if you fail to act. Do what must be done. Discover your humanity and your love in revolution. And so, one thing that we really want to be really thoughtful about, and this is, again, something that Palestinians do actually incredibly well. We were in a delegation last summer in Palestine, meeting with Adamir, and then also, looking in Daheshi refugee camp around like photos of martyrs and political prisoners. In the US, you'll often hear people say things like, everyone makes a mistake, or maybe the falsely accused people, but not the rapists and the murderers, right? So there's this like narrative that people in prisons, even among people in our movements, right, are bad or harmful or have to learn their lesson. And we have to actively fight against that narrative, y'all. The only way that we can really advance is if we understand that every single person, and I mean every single person who's locked up in a cage in the US is a political prisoner. And those that are practicing resistance are particularly advanced and deserve our respect, our admiration, and particularly our solidarity. And, we say that Free Palestine is an abolitionist demand. And the reason why we say that is because, the worldview that says that we need to have a society that is not contingent on police and prisons is also, the same demand that we believe in a world without US imperialism. We believe in a world without the tyranny of one state telling every other country in the world how it can live or die. And so when we say Free Palestine, it can't be disconnected from how we're fighting the settler colony on this land, and how they mediate the settler colony on this land through criminalization. And so this is a really powerful narrative of how prisoners in Palestine wrote in solidarity with prisoners on strike in the US. It's something that's incredibly moving to me, and I shared this a lot when it came out 2 years ago. And they started by mourning George Jackson the imprisoned revolutionary and martyr of the Black liberation struggle. The strike is beginning on the 47th anniversary of his martyrdom, an event that was recognized in Palestine around the world at the time as an assassination of a true voice of struggle by the US ruling class. So one thing I just want to really pause and say, Can you imagine the amount of just sort of revolutionary spirit required for you to feel so deeply connected to a revolutionary ancestor in another land, right? I mean, just like think of like the amount of like spirit and creativity and steadfastness, to use that word, right, that takes. I mean, that is so incredibly moving. And so I think, again, there's like stories like these all throughout, prisons and jails in the US. And so I think it's something that we really should keep in mind in terms of our own organizing, for sure. And then this is, again, just bring us back to sort of like freedom, dreaming, and radical imagination. These are photos from the Freedom Papers, and really just thinking about how we can incorporate art, right, into our movement practice. So really quickly for the last few minutes, I'm going to kind of talk nitty-gritty tactics. I don't know who's on the call, so I'm an organizer, so this is what we do. So what we talked about was mostly like kind of like theory and like context and like how we see the world. So this is what we're doing right now to like get people out of cages. So in Miami-Dade County, which is the 8th largest incarcerated jail population in the country, 8th largest jail system in the country, we've launched a campaign called Free the Block. And so I'll share resources in a minute, but so what we're demanding is, again, like we want to get people out of jails, and we want a Miami in which jails don't exist. So I'm going to go through this really quickly, but like one of the reasons we focus on jails is because it's been one of the highest increases in mass incarceration over the last 10, 15 years has been in the jail population. So all of these things that we were saying around warehousing poor people, again, around slashing social infrastructure, this has all led to exploding jail populations. The majority of people in jails have not actually yet been convicted of a crime. They're there, the majority of people there are there because they can't afford to pay their court bond, which is a kind of ransom that people have to pay in order to go home before their trial. So yeah, non-democratic and ineffective court system. So allegedly in the settler colony, if you're a citizen, you're entitled to a speedy trial. You have people who sit in jails for years who have never gone to trial. And so, of course, primarily poor Black and brown people. Khalif Browder, the tragedy of that story, a teenager accused of stealing a backpack who sat in Rikers for 3 years, I think is a really famous story of that. But yeah, it's an issue across jails around the country. And of course, anti-Blackness. I don't need to explain that to y'all. I think that's like pretty clear. Jails are fucking racist wherever you are in the US. And then for sure, institutionalized brutality against people who are houseless and people with mental illness. So instead of the state taking care of people who are the most vulnerable, they actually punish them and blame them, again, for being a vulnerable population rather than creating the conditions where we can take care of one another. So as soon as COVID-19 hit, because we've been doing this work and because we've been in community, we immediately, I think, similar to Diana's organization, released a set of demands. And I will, let me see how I can do this. I just want to, no, that's okay. I will share these links after I'm done talking, sorry. But yeah. So we released a set of demands around getting people out of jails. And, you know, I'll throw those demands in the chat, but a lot of it was just around like, if someone's awaiting their trial, let them go home instead of locking them up. If someone has less than 60 days on their sentence, let them go home. And since then, we've been involved in litigation, suing the jail system in Miami to especially release medically vulnerable people. I mean, the stories are absolutely disgusting and heartbreaking. You've got 60 to 70 people sharing a cell. Of course, there's no way to socially distance in a jail, right? And so essentially, you know, jails have exhibited some of the highest rates of COVID-19 infection in the entire world. And so what we're saying is that a jail sentence should not be a death sentence, and we need people to be released now. So here's some of the tactics that we're applying locally in terms of like how we're targeting the jail system in Miami. So though courts are sort of like mildly suspended right now, we, before this all started, has launched a court watching program. So watching what's happening in the courts to see just how racist these judges are, to see what's happening with bond. Before this all started, I was sitting in court and watched a man who was accused of stealing underwear be given a $2,500 bond, right? And so it's important to record these things for you to really understand the sort of like mechanics of how the criminal legal system functions. So you can also like hold judges accountable and see if you can support people in getting them out. Start to support a community bond fund. I saw people in the chat throwing links to a bond fund. I am part of the leadership body of a bond fund locally in Miami through FemPower, which is a feminist collective in Miami. So if you go to like FemPower's Instagram, you can see like the link to donate if you have the funds. We also do a lot of culture shifting work, whether that be through banner drops or different actions or graphics or just helping uplift the narratives of people on the inside. To Diana's point earlier, it's absolutely critical that we uplift and center the voices of people who are on the inside and their family members. We participate in mutual aid. So with the bond fund, you know, when we're bailing people out, we give them rides home. We deliver groceries to them if they need access to toiletries, clothes, whatever. You know, we organize volunteers to do those deliveries. And in turn, you know, we are trying to build with people once they're bailed out to see like what gifts do you want to offer to the collective and the community. So that you have the mutual aspect of it instead of just direct aid. And of course, pressure campaigns. So holding folks like state attorneys, judges, and other folks accountable who have a lot of power over who gets incarcerated, who gets released, what crimes are prosecuted, and all these things. And I could spend like, again, like a whole hour just talking about these tactics. But the last thing I do want to talk about is just sort of like an action that we had recently in Miami, where we, you know, drove around the jail and the court and honked our horn and held banners and chanted for folks on the inside of the jail to hear us. And I do have just like a couple of videos that I want to share that are really short. Sorry, this is not like the prettiest setup, but it's Zoom, so it's like we just got to do what we got to do.
You deserve to be free and home. You deserve to be alive and healthy and coronavirus free. And we're going to fight until it happens. And we will rise up with you, day after day.
So what you're hearing also is that folks put together like a mix that we could listen to as we were driving around the jail and the court, which is really powerful. And the last thing that I'm going to share is from this incredible family, the Swains. Their son has been locked in the jail for the last 4 years, and he's fighting for his life right now. And I just was so moved by like what they had to share at our demonstration, which was actually yesterday. So I'm going to share this really quickly.
This is a slow death that they have. His body has constantly deteriorated from where it was when he initially went in until where he is now. He can hardly raise his right arm, his left arm, to even answer the phone when we go out there to visit him. This is horrible. And they have the audacity, the mitigated goal, to go to third world countries and try to condemn them for the way that they're treating their people. Let us clean up our own backyard. Let us clean up our own front yard. Look at the homeless down the street. I didn't realize there were so many of them that don't even have a house to go in, no place. My wife and I cooks for them every Saturday night where we go out and feed these people that the society has neglected. They treat dogs better than we do. They treat dogs, animals, better than they don't have no place to shower. They don't have no place to eat, no place to brush their teeth, nothing of that nature. But yet and still, this is America. This is the breadbasket of the world. But yet and still, when America sneezes, every other nation in the world catch a cold. Every other nation catch a cold when America sneezes. God is going to bring justice to America. This is just the beginning of what the end is going to be.
So I just really wanted to share that because I think we've been talking about all these sort of different threads. And, you know, here you have the parents of someone who is locked up whose life is on the line, making those connections of how the US goes after other countries while doing such cruelty here, while ignoring the vulnerable populations here, while can't even take care of the people who live here on this land, right? And they're still fighting, right? And they're not just fighting for their child, they're fighting for all of us. They're fighting for all the people who are locked up. And so last thing I'll say is abolition is not a pipe dream. Abolition is practical, possible, and urgent. Abolition is something we think about and we dream about and we fight for every single day. Every single day we have choices that we make that leads us closer to abolition. And so I think with that, this last quote from Adrienne Marie Brown, all organizing is science fiction. We are bending the future together into something we have never experienced, a world where everyone experiences abundance, access, pleasure, human rights, dignity, freedom, transformative justice, peace. We long for this. We believe it is possible. So yeah, thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much, Zaina. That was amazing. Thank you for sharing the action items and the demands list. I wanted to ask really quickly if you have any other action items you'd like to share before we move on to other action items.
Yeah, in the chat, I'm going to drop a bunch of different links that includes like our demands, how to sign on to them, how to donate to the bond fund, and all that like good stuff.
Okay, perfect. I also wanted to note for all the attendees that we'll be sending out a follow-up email tomorrow with all of these resources as well, including all of the action items and the resources we shared during the slides. So don't worry about having to save that. Okay, thank you so much, Zaina. Diana, I wanted to bring it back to you to ask you to share action items from California Coalition for Women Prisoners. Diana, I think you're muted still, sorry.
Hi. So yes, thank you. So this is just a few things. I didn't want to overwhelm people. Most of the action items are developing because new responses are coming every day. We're in car caravans to the Santa Rita jail that we're trying to get decarcerated in Sacramento. We're working on that. We're having new Twitter storms. Today was a whole thing that the no new jails in San Francisco to shut down 850 Bryant, which is the jail here. So every day there are more different types of things. So the best thing in terms of us is just trying to get people to get on our mailing list, email list, sign up for all the information that we have all the time. I really appreciated Zaina's overview and all the tactics. I think I do want to say that at this point in time, one of the really important things to me is the coming together of a lot of organizations around the country who have been working around decarceration and abolition. And there is much more coalition building, which I think is extremely important. And I feel like this webinar comes at a particularly that important time because it can make the links to what's going on in Palestine. And that's something that I feel like, we've been trying to figure out, and I know all the people in PYM and other organizations have been trying to do, but how do you really make the reality of Palestinian prisoners present in the US movement? I think that's a really critical need in order to really link the issues of abolition internationally. And so I hope maybe some of the questions and answers, we can get into that more. I know there are a bunch of other webinars happening later this week on Palestinian Prisoner Day on Friday, one with Ademir from Palestine itself and others that have other Palestinians who can speak to what's happening on the ground. So I think those are also very important next steps in terms of making those connections and enabling a much broader sector of the movement and of people in general to be aware of what the connections around imprisonment here and in Palestine really is about. Thanks.
Thank you, Diana. So now we're going to move on to a few other calls to action. I'm going to pass it on to Ra'a to walk us through those.
Okay. Hi everyone. So thank you again, Osama, Diana, and Zena for sharing your knowledge and your work with us. It's been really, really helpful and incredible, and your work is really important. So thank you. So now with like the newly gained knowledge that we have and the context of how important this is in general, of course, and especially right at this moment, we're going to be talking about some demands and calls to action. So as Diana mentioned, there's a movement within Ademir, and Ademir has a petition which seeks to allow prisoners to have family and lawyers visit. And then the ICRC, the current ask is for the ICRC, which is the Red Cross or Red Crescent, is to intervene since they are the only organization with physical access to detainees. And then I'm actually going to be handing it off to Charlotte and Muhammad from Samidoun to speak about Samidoun's demands. So Samidoun, or the Palestinian Prison Solidarity Network, is an international network of organizers and activists working to build solidarity with Palestinian prisoners in their struggle for freedom. So if y'all want to take it away.
Thank you so much for inviting Samidoun to be part of the conversation today that's happening. It's a really important conversation, and it's an honor to join all of you. I just want to share a few things with people. You already mentioned the work that Samidoun is doing. We organize to amplify the voices of the Palestinian prisoners movement, and recognizing that the Palestinian struggle is a struggle not only against Zionism, not only confronting the Israeli state, but against imperialism, against oppression everywhere, against racism, against colonialism and capitalism. This means that we recognize that the struggle is global. And so the fight to free Palestinian political prisoners, the fight to free Palestinian prisoners from Israeli jails, comes hand in hand with the struggle to free prisoners everywhere and to fight back against the systems of oppression that create colonialism, occupation, and apartheid in Palestine, and also in the United States and around the world. With that being said, with Palestinian Prisoners Day coming up on April 17th, we have a series of actions that are taking place. I can't share my screen with you right now, but I'll put some links in the chat. We have a week of action for Palestinian liberation. And so because of COVID-19, many of the actions that would normally be on the ground actions and demonstrations are instead moving online. So there's a Twitter storm that's taking place on April 17th. There are a couple different ones. There's one all day long using the hashtag #WeAreWithYou. And there's also one that's taking place in the afternoon using the hashtag Palestinian Prisoners Day, organized by the U.S. Palestinian Community Network. We have a list of all of these actions on our website at samidoun.net, and we invite people to share them. The Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee in New York is also organizing a series of actions on April 17th as part of this day, recognizing once again that Palestinian Prisoners Day is a day that stands for global liberation, solidarity, and struggle. So this is about freeing prisoners from the United States to Palestine and everywhere around the world. As part of the campaign, we're also highlighting certain key struggles, such as those of the Holy Land Five in the United States, Palestinian political prisoners jailed here, as well as George Ibrahim Abdallah, a Lebanese Arab communist struggler for Palestine who's been imprisoned in French prisons for 35 years. We encourage people to get involved in their organizing and movement locally, nationally, and internationally. There are Samidun chapters in various areas around the world, including in occupied Palestine, in Lebanon, in Greece, in Sweden, in France, Canada, and the United States. And elsewhere, we have that information on our website, as well as the links to the Days of Solidarity actions that are taking place, as well as the Zoom calls that are being organized. And as Samidun, we want to invite all of you from all of the organizations that are present to work together and to struggle together as we fight for a liberated future and as we fight for a future that's free of Zionism, imperialism, and colonialism. So thank you again for inviting us to be part of this, and for all of the knowledge, information that you have brought to us today. Our website can be found at samidun.net. I don't see Mohammed here among the panelists, or else I would be happy to pass the mic over to him right now.
All right. Yeah, thank you for sharing that with us. So now we're going to have Sana from U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights introducing the U.S. CPR calls to action.
Hi, everyone. This was so fantastic and so comprehensive. I'm so glad to be able to be here today. I think, I really have loved this framing, and I was so excited to be on this webinar because it just really connects the struggles for abolition here in the US to Palestinian prisoners and the need to free them all now, especially with the coronavirus and the added urgency. So USCPR is building a campaign that specifically pressures members of Congress here in the US. I think there's a couple of places of connection here. One, obviously, that for folks who are in the US, our tax dollars fund prisons, immigrant detention centers, and we send $3.8 billion to the Israeli occupation every year. That funds child detention and political prisoners and all of the there's this real legacy of us funding oppression both here and in Palestine. So that's kind of the framework that we're taking to defund child detention in particular and plug in to free them all. We're targeting members of Congress in particular districts to push them to issue a really strong statement around calling on Israel to release all prisoners, including child prisoners, and demanding that prisoners here in the US, including folks in immigrant detention, are freed. Very deliberately taking that full-on framing that none of these things can really be separated from the other and building pressure around that campaign. We think that members of Congress in particular, Congress is literally on recess right now. A lot of abolition campaigns have, for good reason, been focused on mayors and been focused in the US, have been focused on mayors or governors, but there is actual power in Congress issuing statements and pushing to defund ICE. There are all these things that could happen at the federal level, and these people are just sitting there literally on recess while the whole country and the whole world is burning. So we feel really strongly that this is such an important piece of action to take. And I wanted to share with folks, if you're interested in getting at all more involved in this, we're doing a bunch of train the trainer calls on how to get more involved in this campaign and how to really plug in. I just shared it out here and it'll go out afterwards as well. To give a sense of folks very quickly on the sort of framing we're using. Oh, okay, someone else is screen sharing, so I can't. But we're really, really pushing folks to for members of Congress to get these petitions, and we're doing on the ground phone banking to get people to effectively do virtual canvassing, to talk to folks and be hey, this is how we see these things as connected. Will you put your name here and join us in this campaign in your district? So really specifically building power to get this member of Congress to take action. So we would love to have you, and we would love to talk more about it. But that is some of the stuff that we're trying to work on to build power in this moment where people need to be released today, yesterday, 2 weeks ago at this point, and how can we really build that urgency?
Thank you so much, Sana, and thank you to everyone who shared calls to action. I want to do a brief reminder that we will be sending all of these calls to action in an email tomorrow, along with different resources that we mentioned throughout the PowerPoint, so don't worry about that. I want to transition us into our question and answer section. I also want to note that we are going to go over time a little bit, so hopefully that's okay with folks online. So yeah, we'll start with our first question. We're going to ask, this one is for Osama. Osama, can you talk about Palestinian prisoners in the US? And can you also talk about the Holy Land 5 and the current conditions of Palestinian prisoners in Palestine?
Yes, I can speak briefly about Palestinian political prisoners in the United States. I'll particularly highlight the Holy Land Foundation. So the Holy Land Foundation is a very significant case in the history of surveillance and imprisonment of Palestinians, Palestinian Muslims in the United States in the era of the War on Terror. It was the largest Islamic charity in America. It was founded and run by Palestinians. So the Holy Land 5 Foundation provided aid to Palestinians in need, particularly orphans. And so in 2001, without any probable cause, through the Patriot Act, George Bush designated the Holy Land 5 a terrorist organization, even though, and this is in the details of the case, a lot of the charities the Holy Land Foundation was funding, was giving money to, were the same charities that the United States State Department and other institutions were also funneling money into, that were also providing for Palestinians who needed it, particularly orphans. So when George Bush designated the Holy Land 5 a terrorist organization, the State Department seized all Holy Land Foundation assets and imprisoned the officers of the Holy Land 5. And then 3 years later, in 2004, a federal grand jury charged the Holy Land 5 and 5 of its officers with material support for terrorism. The mission of the Holy Land 5, or Holy Land Foundation, was to find and implement practical solutions for human suffering through humanitarian programs that impact the lives of the disadvantaged, disinherited, and displaced people suffering from man-made and natural disasters. So again, the organization is actually Holy Land Foundation. The 5 officers being imprisoned is what made the name the Holy Land 5. Next slide. And here were the key people. I just want to make the point that so the closure of the Holy Land 5 and the conviction of these 5 men was meant to have a chilling effect on Muslim and Arab communities in this country, and to hinder their ability to mobilize around any issue, particularly social justice issues, particularly Palestinian self-determination. And so the case was one of the most vile attempts by the US regime to stretch the definition of material support for terrorism, going as far as vilifying charitable works. And so the strategy is a part of a long tradition of the US government using incarceration to criminalize Black and immigrant communities as well, and to silence political activism and dissent. And through that, community empowerment, as that is what the imperialist settler colonial regimes fear and want to oppose, is this idea that communities can be self-sufficient, can garner community political power against state institutions that practice oppression. I think the targeting and imprisonment of the Holy Land 5 is due to the fact that their mission was explicitly rooted in community empowerment, and that they worked to alleviate the conditions caused by Israeli settler colonialism in Palestine. And the Palestinian Youth Movement later will send a link out on a statement that they wrote that goes into more detail about the case and its significance. Okay, so situation on the ground. Situation on the ground in Palestine. Actually, let me see. Yeah, I want to highlight what Dr. Rabab Abdul Hadi said. I think to resist Islamophobia, it's important to note that it's about anyone standing against U.S. imperialism and Zionism, as well as, you know, through the targeting of leftists and other radicals. So that Muslim organizing, especially, plays an important role within the Palestinian movement. I want to say regarding the situation on the ground in Palestine, a little bit about Oslo that I was saying previously was that now I would say the prisoners are more isolated than they were previously. Not completely, not absolutely, but thanks to the neoliberal economic system that was brought forth and installed in Palestine, the pacification of the Palestinian community organizations, the popular committees, through, again, NGOization, this proliferation of NGOs into Palestine, what that resulted is this cutoff of that sustaining structure, that sustaining network that was able to promote and allow the prisoner committee to organize and be able to carry on demands and to basically have a stake and be able to influence to a lesser degree now, although they do have an influence on what happens in the Palestinian street. So essentially now the greater difficulty in terms of organizing for prisoner conditions and prisoner rights. But to talk more about the situation on the ground, I really want to center Palestinian public health as it relates to the prisoner struggle and especially the pandemic. So in light of the current COVID-19 state lockdowns, Palestinians have been making it clear on social media that the siege on Gaza and the curfews in the West Bank, which have always been there, are essentially increasing. The difference between the curfews and the current state of global quarantine is that with military imposed lockdowns, there is the added element that remaining inside does not necessarily ensure your safety or that of others. Next slide. So with COVID-19 in Gaza, there are just 40 ICU beds for 2 million people who are under siege. Currently 1,000 people per bed in the Gaza Strip. Currently 650 to 750 people per bed in the West Bank. So it's important to note also that the difficult conditions that are now being experienced, especially in light of the pandemic, have always been there. And in terms of when we talk about Israeli policy in occupied Palestinian lands, it's important to mention that Israeli policy has always, regarding healthcare within Palestine, has been to obstruct the development of Palestinian health institutions, to obstruct Palestinian access to hospitals and clinics. So Israel, through the siege on Gaza, through its decades and decades of military settler occupation, has essentially deteriorated all the fundamental preconditions for public health. 330,000 Palestinians living in Area C who are served by 15 mobile clinics. There's a long history of where these mobile clinics emerged from. They emerged from the same sort of popular mass-based structures that emerged even before the first Intifada and that emerged during the Intifada. There was this sense of, when we talked about the national liberation concept and this understanding that political realities in the West Bank stem from, or socioeconomic conditions in the West Bank stem from political realities, they decided to organize and form mass-based structures that subscribe to this understanding. Next slide. Israel is currently holding 5,000 Palestinians in prison. Palestinian detainees recently have come into contact with an Israeli interrogator who tested positive for COVID-19. We don't have any updates. We don't have any information on the status of those infected inside the prisons. Israeli prison services canceled family visits, and this limits the access that advocates have to detainees themselves. Next slide. That's all I got.
Thank you so much, Osama. Before we move on to the next question, I see that Mohammed from Salmidoun joined us. So Mohammed, if you can add to what Charlotte mentioned earlier about Salmidoun's calls to actions briefly.
Thank you so much for inviting me and for allowing me to be in the panel. I want to thank Osama a lot for your presentation at the beginning and now for answering the question. I have nothing to add any more information about political prisoners and the conditions inside Palestine. And to be honest, because I am not from the United States and I have never been there, so I learned a lot about the context in the US and the connection between the Palestinian political prisoners movement with the Black prisoners movement and with the prisoners movement in the United States in general, and with the other building and the ability to build other connections with the Philippine and Latino struggle. So I think this is one of our duty also as a liberated or a free activist, that to build this connection between political prisoners movement in Palestine and around the globe. And we have the ability to do this, and we have the connection. I want to add a little bit more about what Osama mentioned, how we view the political prisoners movement as a Palestinians, as the leadership of our movement. And this is today not a usual thought. Not many people say this, and even within our national liberation movement. And I think as a PYM and SGP, it's also our role to focus on this and to highlight the political prisoners movement struggle, the women movement struggle, and the children's inside prison. This is today is a very specific time when we have Palestinian kids are in prison, when we have big number of very extremely vulnerable women, sick women who need medical care, are deprived of basic rights. This is also the role of the Palestinian National Liberation Movement in general, but for us as a solidarity movement, but not only as a solidarity movement, as a Palestinian political solidarity organizations who view solidarity not on statements only, but more in a practical building relationship, as you are already doing this. And also I want to mention, because as Salmidoun, we are focusing on political prisoners, but also me as a Palestinian refugee from Lebanon, from Al Hilwi camp, I want to use this opportunity to highlight the Palestinian refugee struggle and the right of return. And because I do believe that this struggle is very much connected with the political movement struggle, with the prisoners movement. We should listen more what the political prisoners leaders, what the leaders of the movement inside prison, what their positions on right of return as the central goal and the central core in our movement. If we should organize for political prisoners, we should always organize for right of return and connect them together. And if we view as those political prisoners are our real and serious leadership, we have not to be shy to mention this and to highlight this loudly, to say to our community, to use the culture that this political prisoners movement is building. Political prisoners are not only suffering and struggling because they are isolated and they need medical care. In the meantime, they are building a revolutionary school inside prison. They are building a culture of resistance that we should learn from. And I think we can use this culture and our role to spread this culture within our community And this is how we organize our community. When every Palestinian today agree about political prisoners, every Palestinian today want to support political prisoners. There is no political division on political prisoners. There is no strategical division. This is where we unite. Prisoners, right of return. I think this is where we should mobilize and focus. And as a youth, as a Palestinian organizations like PYM or SGP, I personally know very much, and we salute you and other organizations, Dream Defender and all organizations are present here. We know how you are struggling. We know the state repression and state violence in the United States, and we know also that it's very similar to the Zionist movement, and what they are applying on our people in Palestine. So also our struggle in the United States as a Palestinian community, it's for our daily right in the US or in Europe, is very much connected with our struggle for right of return and for the liberation of Palestine. So building on that, I think we should focus more on our duties within internal our community, and also being the bridges between our people in isolated in Palestine with the solidarity movement and the liberation movement around the world. And we salute you for your steadfastness in the United States and for the specific place in the world, in the belly of the empire that you are struggling for. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Muhammad.
Thank you, Muhammad.
Yeah.
That was amazing. Okay, so moving on to our next question, we're combining two questions, one from Ziggy, one from Nadia, and this is directed towards Diana. So can the panelists give us some examples of internationalism and solidarity between movements behind bars? Diana, you're muted.
Thank you. So I think one very good example, there are many that I feel like could be referred to historically, but one that I was part of, and Dr. Abdul Hadi, who's on this webinar, was also part of, so I think it would be good to mention it. In 2013, there was a hunger strike across California among prisoners who were protesting solitary confinement, which some people had been in solitary confinement for like 3 decades. So they were protesting, and of course, by doing a hunger strike, and Palestinian prisoners have led worldwide, globally around, using the hunger strike to really as a last resort, but as a way of really demonstrating their fierceness, their commitment. And so we help facilitate a message from, okay, I am sorry, forgetting his name right this minute, but a Palestinian person who had been on hunger strike for a long time and then had been released. And so we got that message from the people inside, from Palestine, and we were able to communicate it to the people in prison who were on hunger strike. And so I think that was, and it was very inspiring to many people. The hunger strike went on, it had some success, and one of the high points that people still mention is that kind of connection where there were solidarity messages, much like what Zaina was talking about with the message from Palestine to the national hunger strike in 2018. So those are some examples that we have that I want to highlight. I feel like in terms of women, I would say that there has been specific efforts made. We did a lot of work to publicize Ahid Tamimi's case when she was in prison, and we tried to bring that into various types of actions in the US and raise them in the Women's March and other ways. So that's another example of, and we use our newsletter to also make those connections and bring the stories of Palestinian women in particular to the people who are inside in women's prisons here as a form of inspiration. So those are a couple of examples. And I'm going to have to leave. I have another meeting coming up. But I also, since we are talking about solidarities and political prisoners, I just unfortunately learned that Mumia has been hospitalized with symptoms of COVID-19. So I'm just, that's a very scary and critical connection that we can make, and that I just wanted to let everybody know on this webinar, since I know that there will be a lot of protest opportunities to express solidarity. Really keep him in our thoughts and hearts in the next period, because of course he is so vulnerable, having been in prison for so many decades. I am sorry if people don't know who Mumia is. I'm assuming most people do, because he is one of the most well-known political prisoners, Black political prisoners in this country. But he has been in prison since 1981, falsely accused, an amazing journalist and writer, inspirational, and a leader of you know, resistance to imprisonment in this country. So I don't have a link, but I'm sure people will be able to find information out about him very soon. So please check that out after the webinar. So, and thanks again. I do have to get off, and I really appreciate the organizers and all the amazing knowledge and information and activism that's been shared. And yeah, thanks again.
Thank you so much for joining us, Diana. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Diana.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll move on to our last question before we wrap things up. So Osama, hopefully you can answer this for us. The question is from Bisan. They ask, I want to teach my younger siblings about prison abolition, especially when I hear them say things like, if there were no police, there would be so much crime. They're in elementary and high school. Does anyone have material that is suitable for children to understand the harm of carcerality?
First thing, I want to, it's pretty saddening to hear about the condition of Mumia Abu Jamal. I'd like just to keep him in our hearts and our minds, and organize around him, and inshallah his liberation will come soon. I don't think I can think of material for children regarding mass incarceration. I would say it's, you know, I think it starts with a baseline understanding of, you know, in terms of talking to your younger siblings about imprisonment, mass incarceration. It really starts with slowly trying to get them to understand the political system and the reality of, you know, how certain oppressive structures come to be. So I have a little sister, and I've, you know, when I'm talking to her about Palestine, it always starts with a, you know, kind of a very slow step into first talking about, well, here's Palestine, we're not there, why aren't we there? And then we slowly try and answer those questions. And I would think that the same would apply to trying to getting them to understand, you know, mass incarceration, and to get them to not think of prisoners in the, you know, derogatory light that they're always placed in within the US. If anyone would want to contribute to answering this question,
Can I add something, Osama?
Yes.
There is a very nice novel. It was written by Walid Daqqa, one of the oldest Palestinian political prisoners. He's from 48. It's called The Secret of the Oil, which is, the secret of the olive oil. And actually, it's a very short novel, and it's more like it could be an animation movie for children. And I think this should be translated. And this political prisoners, Walid, he became a father recently when he smuggled his sperm out because he's married since long time. He was married in prison. And another thing I want to mention apart from this idea, just closing with this, I forget to mention before, especially with a meeting like with PYM and SGP. Lately in Palestine, the student movement and the youth movement are facing a very strong campaign attack by the Israeli enemy, and they are mostly in prisons. Lately, Adamir and Samidun published very important report talking about torture for youth leaders from Nabid, from another students' union, from different organizations. I think this, it's our role also to mention the names and the stories of these youth political prisoners and organizers in the campuses of Bir Zaid and Al-Quds universities. And because also lately, they are the only one in Palestine with other small forces, especially in West Bank, who are able to organize demonstrations and events for political prisoners. And also they are receiving attacks from the Israelis as they are arrested, but also from the PA. So I think mentioning their names and campaigning for them, this gives the students' movement in Palestine more protection. And I think this is something that we can focus on and build on lately. Thank you.
Real quick, Muhammad, did you say it was a short film or it should be Secret of the Oil?
No, it could be, like, it's a novel. It's just written.
Okay.
But I think maybe we can translate it. Maybe Hatim can.
On the student prisoners, I just wanted to put a link in the chat box for people, because this also has graphics, stories, and a video that people can use in their campaigning as well.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. Okay, so it looks like we're ready to close out. Do any of the panelists have closing remarks before we do our closing? Okay, so let me move this here to our, okay, so I just want to thank everyone who joined the webinar today, especially during these really difficult times. We just want to remind everyone that this is just the first of the series, so please look out for our next webinars that we'll be announcing on social media. You can follow us at all of these addresses. And I also want to boost some things coming up. Again, all of this will be in the follow-up email. But please stay tuned for a webinar on Friday with Bir Zaid, Samidun, and PYM. Let's see, I believe I have the link to register here. And then also tomorrow there will be a presentation with Adamir and Palestine Solidarity Committees in the UK. So please register with this link, which I'll send now.
I forgot that I'm the last panelist left. I have nothing to say other than thank you for the opportunity. Thank you to NSJP for facilitating. Thank you for Samidou for being present. And the struggle continues, and I hope that it was beneficial to all.
Thank you so much, Osama. And thank you, Palestinian Youth Movement, for the content and the presenting on Palestinian political prisoners. And then again, a quick shout out to Dream Defenders, which Zaina spoke from, and California Coalition of Women and Prisoners, which Diana spoke from. And then last thing is, we have a survey that we will be sending out in tomorrow's email, but I'll also link that in the chat here. Please fill it out and let us know what else you'd like to see from this series so that we can keep that in mind when we plan the rest of it. we really want your input on that, so please make sure to fill that out, and then also look out for an email that will be sent tomorrow with all of this information. And of course, look out for all of the action items on social media on Friday, which is Palestinian Political Prisoner Day. But yeah, I think if none of the other panelists have anything to add, I think we're good to go.
I just want to mention that especially about Cameron Mumia Abu Jamal, we are in full solidarity with his special situation and also with all political prisoners in the United States. But especially in this week with solidarity with Palestinian political prisoners, we will be happy to receive any materials, articles, any documents that would be published on Samidun. We will be happy to publish it, also to translate it. And I think this will be very good for us, that if we can bring these voices to the Palestinians people, if we translate about Mumia Abu Jamal in Arabic and about his news, this will be very effective way of building solidarity. So we are happy for any help or materials we receive at Samidun. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. Any other last words from the panelists? Okay.
How much time do we have?
Oh, sorry, what?
Do we have any time at all? Are we completely past time?
I mean, is there something that you want to talk about or like boost really quickly?
I just kind of wanted to mention the history of some international solidarity. It would be like really brief, like 1 minute. I didn't have time to mention this, but there was, examples of international solidarity. Just to add to it, in 1981, Bobby Sands of the Irish Republican Army, they led a hunger strike against the conditions of the prison system. And during their strike, the Irish masses voted him into Irish Parliament, which electrified the movement. In response, Palestinian prisoners from one of the most brutal occupation prisons, Nafha, smuggled out a statement of solidarity and support, which was: to the families of the martyrs oppressed by the British ruling class, to the families of Bobby Sands, we revolutionaries of the Palestinian people who are under the terrorist rule of Zionism, write you this letter from the prison of Nafha. We extend our salute and solidarity with you in the confrontation against the oppressive rule enforced by the British ruling elite. And so that internationalism in our context, with the Black struggle, with many different struggles, they're not just statements, they're public demonstrations of refusal, a radical opposition to imperialist and capitalist systems. They serve as lessons to us who are in the movement. A lesson of the trajectory of our movements inevitably towards internationalism, towards joint struggle against the imperialists and settler colonists of this world. So I just wanted to highlight the important aspect and examples of international solidarity.
That was great. Thank you so much, Osama. Okay, I think we will end it there. Thank you again for everyone who joined, and please look out for the rest of our series. Yatikum al-afia, ma'as-salama.
Yatikum al-afia. Thanks, everyone.
Yatikum al-afia.
Thanks so much.